Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 25. Part 4, The Joseph Narrative and Conclusion, Genesis 37:50. The Joseph Narrative and Conclusion, Genesis 37:50, form the final section of the book of Genesis, shifting focus from the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to Joseph, whose story of betrayal, enslavement, imprisonment, and rise to power in Egypt resolves familial conflicts and positions Israel for its next phase in Egypt. This section, often described as a novella due to its cohesive plot and character development, integrates the covenantal promises of Genesis 12:1-3, land, descendants, blessing, while emphasizing divine providence, forgiveness, and the formation of Israel's tribal identity. The narrative concludes with Jacob's blessings, death, and Joseph's legacy, tying up Genesis themes and preparing for the Exodus narrative, Exodus 1:15. Rooted in the Late Bronze Age and shaped by the exilic context, Genesis 37:50 engages ancient Near Eastern traditions, resonates across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, and addresses modern issues of reconciliation, leadership, and faith. Below, 9 points outline the key dimensions of Genesis 37:50, each explored in detail to illuminate their theological, historical, and cultural significance. 1. Historical and archaeological context. The Joseph narrative is set in the Late Bronze Age, c. 1500–1200 BCE, a period of Egyptian imperial dominance, regional trade, and cultural exchange in the ancient Near East. Its historical context, supported by archaeological evidence and textual parallels, grounds the story in a plausible milieu, enhancing its narrative credibility and theological weight. Late Bronze Age setting. The narrative depicts Joseph's journey from Canaan to Egypt, reflecting regional migration patterns evidenced by the Amanna letters, c. 14th century BCE, which document Semitic groups in Egypt. Joseph's role as a vizier, Genesis 41:40–46, aligns with Egyptian administrative structures, as seen in the Tale of Two Brothers, c. 13th century BCE, which describes foreigners in high office. Cultural details. Joseph's enslavement, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, imprisonment, Genesis 39 hours 20 minutes, and dream interpretation, Genesis 40:41, match Egyptian practices, with Papyrus Westcar, c. 1600 BCE, recording dream oracles and Hyksos-era inscriptions, c. 1650–1550 BCE, noting Semitic officials in Egypt. Canaanite tribal dynamics, such as the brothers' rivalry, Genesis 37:3-11, and Midianite trade routes, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, align with execration texts, c. 19th–18th century BCE, and archaeological finds like Tel El Dabbe, a Hyksos capital with Semitic influences. Babylonian exile composition. Likely finalized during the Babylonian exile, 587–539 BCE, the narrative addresses Judah's displacement, with Joseph's exile and restoration, Genesis 37:50, mirroring exilic hopes for return, as in 2nd Isaiah, Isaiah 40:55. The emphasis on divine providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, counters Babylonian imperial ideologies, affirming God's sovereignty. The exilic context shapes the narrative's themes of forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, and communal unity, Genesis 49, offering hope for restoration, preparing for the Torah's redemption narrative, Exodus 1:15. Archaeological significance. Excavations at Tel el-Dabeh reveal Semitic settlements in the Nile Delta, supporting the narrative's depiction of Israel's migration, Genesis 46:1-7. Egyptian reliefs from the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, depict Asiatic slaves and officials, paralleling Joseph's story. While direct evidence of Joseph is absent, the narrative's details, grain storage, Genesis 41:47-49, Egyptian names, Zaphanath-Paneah, Genesis 41:45, and burial practices, Genesis 50:2-3, match archaeological and textual data, enhancing historical plausibility. Theological and cultural impact. The historical context grounds the narrative in a tangible world, informing Jewish liturgy, Veichi Parsha, and Zionist narratives of exile and return. It resonates in Christian and Islamic theology, with Joseph's leadership inspiring interfaith reflections. Globally, the context fuels biblical archaeology, tourism, for example, Avaris excavations, and media, bridging ancient Egypt and modern audiences. 2 theological themes and motifs. The Joseph narrative introduces theological themes, divine providence, forgiveness, covenantal continuity, leadership, and communal identity, that resolve Genesis themes and prepare for the Torah's redemptive arc. Divine providence. Joseph's declaration, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good," Genesis 50:20, encapsulates divine providence, orchestrating events, betrayal, Genesis 37:18-28, enslavement, Genesis 39:1, imprisonment, Genesis 39:20, and rise to power, Genesis 41:40-46, to save Israel and Egypt. This foreshadows the Exodus liberation, Exodus 3:7-10. God's guidance, often implicit, for example, dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, 40-41, ensures covenantal fulfillment, linking to the Torah's divine promises, Deuteronomy 7:9. Forgiveness and reconciliation. Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers, Genesis 45:4-15, and reunion with Jacob, Genesis 46:29-30, model reconciliation, resolving Genesis sibling rivalries, Cain-Abel, Genesis 4, Jacob-Esau, Genesis 27. This prefigures Torah ethics of forgiveness, Leviticus 19:17-18. The narrative's emphasis on teshuvah, repentance, through the brothers' remorse, Genesis 42:21-22, aligns with the Torah's restorative vision, Deuteronomy 31:5. Covenantal continuity. The covenantal promises, Genesis 12:1-3, land, descendants, blessing, are reaffirmed through Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, and Israel's growth in Egypt, Genesis 47:27. Joseph's leadership ensures the covenant's survival, preparing for Exodus nationhood, Exodus 1:7. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, is fulfilled as Joseph saves nations. Genesis 41 hours 57 minutes, prefiguring Israel's role as a light to the nations. Isaiah 42:6. Leadership and responsibility. Joseph's transformation from dreamer, Genesis 37:5-11, to vizier, Genesis 41:40-46, models ethical leadership, with his wisdom, Genesis 41:33-36, and humility, Genesis 45:7-8, reflecting covenantal responsibility, echoing Torah leadership ideals, Deuteronomy 17:14-20. His care for Egypt and Israel, Genesis 47:13-26, balances justice and compassion, prefiguring Moses' leadership, Exodus 18. Communal identity. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, establish Israel's tribal structure, with Judah's leadership, Genesis 49:8-12, foreshadowing Davidic kingship, 2 Samuel 7. This solidifies Israel's identity, preparing for the Torah's tribal organization, Numbers 1:4. The narratives focus on family unity, Genesis 45:16-28, counters earlier divisions, aligning with the Torah's communal vision, Exodus 19:6. Theological impact. These themes unify Genesis, resolving patriarchal conflicts and preparing for the Torah's liberation narrative. They shape Jewish ethics, Tzedakah, Christian salvation, Acts 7:9-16, and Islamic prophetic narratives, Surah Yusuf 12. Globally, they inspire ethical frameworks, from forgiveness to leadership, resonating in interfaith and secular contexts. 3. Narrative structure and literary features. The Joseph narrative structure, a novella-like arc with genealogical and concluding elements, unifies Genesis 37:50 and bridges to the Torah, employing sophisticated literary features to convey its themes. Novella structure. Unlike the episodic patriarchal narratives, Genesis 37:50 forms a cohesive narrative, tracing Joseph's journey from betrayal, Genesis 37:18-28, to reconciliation, Genesis 45:4-15, and legacy, Genesis 50:22-26. The Toledo of Jacob, Genesis 37:2, frames the story, focusing on Joseph and his brothers. Subplots: Judah and Tamar, Genesis 38, Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, and Joseph's death, Genesis 50, integrate covenantal themes, concluding Genesis arc and preparing for Exodus. Literary features. Plot development. The narrative employs a chiastic structure, with Joseph's dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, mirrored by his rise, Genesis 41:40-46, betrayal, Genesis 37:18-28, by reconciliation, Genesis 45:4-15, and exile, Genesis 37 hours 28 minutes, by restoration, Genesis 46:17. This underscores divine providence. Characterization. Joseph's growth from arrogant youth, Genesis 37:2-11, to humble leader, Genesis 45:7-8, contrasts with the brothers' transformation from jealousy, Genesis 37 hours 18 minutes, to remorse, Genesis 42:21-22. Judah's arc, Genesis 38:44-18:34, highlights Teshuvah, prefiguring his leadership, Genesis 49:8-12. Symbolism, dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, 40-41, symbolize divine guidance, while Joseph's coat, Genesis 37:3, and burial in Canaan, Genesis 50 hours 25 minutes, reflect covenantal identity, linking to Torah symbols, tabernacle, Exodus 25. Dialogue and irony, Joseph's speeches, Genesis 45:4-15, and Judah's plea, Genesis 44:18-34, drive emotional depth, with irony, for example, brothers bowing to Joseph, Genesis 42:6, fulfilling Genesis 37:7, emphasizing providence. Narrative continuity. The narrative resolves Genesis themes, sibling rivalry, covenantal promises, while transitioning to Exodus, with Israel's migration, Genesis 46:17, and growth, Genesis 47 hours 27 minutes, setting up enslavement, Exodus 1:8-14. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, and Joseph's death, Genesis 50:22-26, conclude Genesis, linking to the Torah's tribal and redemptive arc, Numbers 1:4, Exodus 1:15. Literary impact. The novella structure shapes Jewish liturgy, Ve'ishev Ve'ichi, Christian sermons, and Islamic storytelling, Surah Yusuf 12, with its cohesive arc inspiring interfaith exegesis. Globally, the narrative's literary sophistication influences novels, films, for example, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and theater, reflecting its universal appeal. For character analysis, Joseph, Judah, and supporting figures. The characters in Genesis 37:50, Joseph, Judah, Jacob, the brothers, and supporting figures like Tamar and Asenath, drive the narrative's theological and emotional depth, modeling transformation, leadership, and covenantal continuity. Joseph. Transformation and leadership, Joseph's journey from favored son, Genesis 37:3-11, to enslaved dreamer, Genesis 39:1, to Egypt's vizier, Genesis 41:40-46, reflects divine providence and personal growth. His wisdom, Genesis 41:33-36, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, model covenantal leadership, prefiguring Moses, Exodus 18. Faith and humility, his acknowledgement of God's role, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, 45:7-8, contrasts with his early arrogance, Genesis 37:5-11, embodying Teshuvah and aligning with Torah ethics, Deuteronomy 8:18. Legacy, Joseph's request for burial in Canaan, Genesis 50 hours 25 minutes, reaffirms the land promise, linking to Joshua's conquest, Joshua 2400 hours 32. Judah. Redemption and responsibility, Judah's arc, from selling Joseph, Genesis 37:26-27, to moral failure with Tamar, Genesis 38, to selfless plea, Genesis 44:18-34, marks Teshuvah, earning him leadership, Genesis 49:8-12, foreshadowing Davidic kingship, 2 Samuel 7. Moral growth, his acknowledgement of guilt, Genesis 38 hours 26 minutes, 44 hours 16 minutes, reflects covenantal ethics, prefiguring Torah repentance, Leviticus 26:40-42. Jacob. Patriarchal closure, Jacob's grief, Genesis 37:33-35, and reunion, Genesis 46:29-30, resolve his ark, with his blessings, Genesis 49, establishing Israel's tribes, linking to Numbers structure, Numbers 1:4. Faithful sojourner, his migration to Egypt, Genesis 46:17, and death, Genesis 49:29-33, reaffirm the covenant, prefiguring Israel's exile and return, Deuteronomy 30. Supporting figures. Tamar, her agency, Genesis 38:14-26, ensures Judah's line, modeling covenantal perseverance, prefiguring Ruth, Ruth 4. Her story highlights women's roles, aligning with Torah inclusivity, Exodus 15:20-21. Asenath and brothers, Asenath's marriage, Genesis 41 hours 45 minutes, integrates Egypt into the covenant, while the brothers' transformation, Genesis 42:21-22, 45:14-15, reflects communal unity, prefiguring Israel's nationhood, Exodus 19:6. Pharaoh and Potiphar's wife, Pharaoh's trust, Genesis 41:40-46, and Potiphar's wife's temptation, Genesis 39:7-12, highlight Joseph's integrity, echoing Torah virtues, Deuteronomy 6:5. Character impact. The characters shape Jewish identity, Veichi blessings, Christian theology, Joseph as a Christ figure, Acts 7, and Islamic narratives, Surah Yusuf. Globally, they inspire leadership models, literature, for example, Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, and art, reflecting universal themes of growth and reconciliation. 5 Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. Rabbinic exegesis, Midrash, Talmud, Rashi, Ramban, and mystical interpretations, Zohar, Kabbalah, deepen the Joseph narrative's theological and ethical significance, linking it to the Torah's redemptive vision. Rabbinic exegesis. Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah views Joseph's dreams, Genesis 37:5-11, as divine prophecy, Bereshit Rabbah 84 hours 10 minutes, with his rise, Genesis 41:40-46, fulfilling God's plan, prefiguring Exodus liberation, Bereshit Rabbah 89:2. Judah's plea, Genesis 44:18-34, models Teshuvah, Bereshit Rabbah 93:8, aligning with Torah repentance, Deuteronomy 30. Talmud, praises Joseph's resistance to temptation, Genesis 39:7-12, Sota 36b, as covenantal fidelity, linking to Torah holiness, Leviticus 19:2. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, are seen as prophetic, shaping Israel's destiny, Sanhedrin 92a. Rashi and Ramban, Rashi clarifies Joseph's providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, linking to Torah redemption, while Ramban sees Judah's leadership, Genesis 49:8-12, as Davidic, prefiguring 2 Samuel 7. Their exegesis unifies Genesis 37:50 with the Torah's arc. Mystical interpretations. Zohar, views Joseph as Yesod, foundation, channeling divine blessing, Zohar, Vaishev 182a, with his trials, Genesis 37:39, purifying the covenant, preparing for Sinai, Exodus 19. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, align the tribes with Sphirot, unifying creation, Zohar, Vaichi 235b. Kabbalistic themes, Joseph's dreams symbolize divine unity, with his leadership restoring Tikkun, creation's repair, echoing Deuteronomy's vision, Deuteronomy 30:19-20. Tamar's agency, Genesis 38, reflects Shekinah's role, prefiguring Torah inclusivity. Interpretive impact. These traditions shape Jewish liturgy, Vaishev Vaichi, education, Shevruta, and ethics, Tzedakah, linking Genesis to Torah law and spirituality. They influence interfaith exegesis, with Christian and Islamic scholars engaging midrashic insights. Globally, the interpretive richness inspires storytelling, from midrashic novels to interfaith dialogues, ensuring the narrative's enduring legacy. 6. Engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The Joseph narrative engages Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite traditions, grounding its story in a familiar milieu while asserting a monotheistic theology. Egyptian cultural parallels. Joseph's role as vizier, Genesis 41:40-46, and grain storage, Genesis 41:47-49, reflect Egyptian administrative practices, as seen in the Tale of Two Brothers and Papyrus Anastasi, c. 13th century BCE. Dream interpretation, Genesis 40:41, parallels Papyrus Westcar's oracles. Egyptian names, Zaphinath Paneah, Asianath, Genesis 41:45, and burial practices, Genesis 50:23, align with New Kingdom customs, grounding the narrative in Egypt's cultural context. Mesopotamian narrative motifs. The sibling rivalry, Genesis 37:18-28, and rise from lowly status motif, Genesis 39:41, echo Mesopotamian tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but Joseph's faith, Genesis 41:16, transforms these into a monotheistic narrative, prefiguring Torah ethics, Deuteronomy 8:18. The theme of divine providence, Genesis 50:20, parallels Akkadian wisdom literature, yet emphasizes YHWH's sovereignty, aligning with Torah monotheism, Exodus 20:23. Canaanite social practices. The brothers' tribal dynamics, Genesis 37:3-11, and Midianite trade, Genesis 37:28, reflect Canaanite clan structures, as seen in Ugaritic texts. Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, adapt Canaanite tribal curses and blessings, prefiguring Torah tribal roles, Numbers 1:4. Theological transformation. The narrative repurposes Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs to affirm YHWH's control, with Joseph's leadership, Genesis 41:40-46, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, reflecting covenantal values, unlike regional transactional ethics. The universal blessing, Genesis 12:3, is fulfilled as Joseph saves nations, Genesis 41:57, transforming regional leadership into a global ethic, aligning with Torah's vision, Leviticus 19:34. Engagement impact. This engagement enhances the narrative's accessibility, shaping Jewish identity and influencing Christian and Islamic theology, Surah Yusuf 12. Globally, it inspires comparative literature, archaeology, and media, bridging ancient and modern worlds. 7. Broader cultural and religious impact. The Joseph narrative profoundly influences Jewish tradition, interfaith theology, and global culture, shaping liturgy, ethics, art, and social movements. Jewish tradition. The narrative informs liturgy, Vayishev Vayichi, with Joseph's providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, and Jacob's blessings, Genesis 49, central to Torah readings. It shapes ethics, tzedakah, forgiveness, and identity, with Joseph's burial request, Genesis 50 hours 25 minutes, fueling Zionist hopes. Rabbinic exegesis, Midrash, Rashi, amplifies Joseph's virtues, influencing education, Shevruta, and communal unity. Christianity. Joseph's trials and rise, Genesis 37:41, prefigure Christ's suffering and exaltation, Acts 7:9-16, with his forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, shaping Christian ethics, Matthew 6:14-15. The narrative influences liturgy, Advent readings, art, Rembrandt's Joseph in Egypt, and theology, Providence, Romans 8:28. Islam. Surah Yusuf, Quran 12, retells Joseph's story, emphasizing his piety, Genesis 39:7-12, and providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, shaping Islamic rituals, 8 sermons, and literature, Rumi's Masnavi. The narrative fosters interfaith dialogue, with Joseph as a shared prophet. Global culture. The narrative inspires literature, Thomas Mann, Andrew Lloyd Webber, art, Tissot's Joseph and His Brethren, and philosophy, Kierkegaard's reflections on providence. Social movements, reconciliation, leadership, draw on Joseph's story, addressing modern issues like conflict resolution and equity. Films, Joseph, King of Dreams, theater, and music adapt the narrative, reflecting its universal themes of redemption and unity. Cultural impact. The narrative unifies religious traditions, shapes interfaith initiatives, for example, Abrahamic Business Circle, and inspires global narratives, ensuring its enduring legacy in ethics, art, and activism. 8. Contemporary relevance and applications. The Joseph narrative remains relevant, addressing modern challenges, leadership, reconciliation, social justice, and cultural fragmentation, through its timeless themes. Spiritual renewal. Joseph's faith, Genesis 41 hours 16 minutes, and providence, Genesis 50 hours 20 minutes, inspire Jewish, Christian, and Muslim spirituality, with digital platforms, Sefaria, Alim, making Genesis 37:50 accessible, fostering devotion amidst secularism. Pew Research, 2023. Social justice. Joseph's care for the hungry, Genesis 41:47-57, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, fuel advocacy for poverty alleviation, Oxfam, and conflict resolution, Seeds of Peace, aligning with UN SDGs, 2015. Tamer's Agency, Genesis 38, informs feminist theology, promoting gender equity. Leadership and ethics. Joseph's leadership, Genesis 41:33-36, and integrity, Genesis 39:7-12, guide modern leadership training. Wexner Foundation, addressing workplace ethics and diversity, Forbes, 2024. Judah's Teshuvah, Genesis 44:18-34, informs restorative justice, resonating in legal reforms. Interfaith dialogue. Joseph's shared role in Abrahamic faiths fosters dialogue, with Surah Yusuf inspiring initiatives like the Abrahamic Family House, 2023. The narrative's reconciliation theme, Genesis 45:4-15, promotes peace building, UN Interfaith Harmony Week, 2024. Cultural innovation. Genesis 37:50 inspires art, ADNES Joseph, literature, Colm Twabine, and media. Netflix's biblical series, with VR tours, Tel El Dabe, and AI exegesis, Spheria, 2024, ensuring accessibility, addressing digital spirituality, Barna, 2024. Relevance impact. The narrative guides modern ethics, activism, and dialogue, shaping policies, EU refugee frameworks, 2021, and cultural expressions, ensuring its relevance in a globalized world. 9. Synthesis, the Joseph narrative as Genesis conclusion and Torah's bridge. The Joseph narrative concludes Genesis by resolving its themes and bridging to the Torah's redemptive arc, preparing for Israel's nationhood and liberation. Theological resolution. The narrative fulfills Genesis' covenantal promises, Genesis 12:1-3, with Joseph's leadership ensuring descendants, Genesis 47:27, and blessing, Genesis 41:57. Providence, Genesis 50:20, and forgiveness, Genesis 45:4-15, resolve patriarchal conflicts, prefiguring Torah redemption, Exodus 3:7-10. Narrative closure. The novella arc unifies Genesis 37:50, transitioning from patriarchal families to tribal Israel, Genesis 49, setting up Exodus enslavement, Exodus 1:8-14. Jacob's blessings and Joseph's death, Genesis 50:22-26, conclude Genesis, linking to the Torah's arc. Historical and cultural bridge. The Late Bronze Age setting and exilic composition ground the narrative, addressing ancient and modern audiences with hope and identity, prefiguring the Torah's liberation narrative, Exodus 1:15. Interpretive depth. Rabbinic and mystical exegesis enrich the narrative, linking Genesis to Torah law and spirituality, ensuring its vitality in Jewish tradition and interfaith theology. Contemporary resonance. The narrative's applications, leadership, reconciliation, justice, extend its relevance, fulfilling the Torah's ethical vision, Leviticus 19:18, and addressing global challenges, migration, equity, peace. Synthesis impact. As Genesis conclusion, Genesis 37:50 bridges ancient promises to Torah redemption, shaping Jewish identity, interfaith theology, and global culture, inviting all to engage its vision of providence, unity, and hope. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members, leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.